All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to anyone who's tuning in. We're on now day 3 of London Build Station. This has been going for the last couple of days, and it's open till May 11th, 24/7 for all the good builders going in the Colosseum. I'm excited to be joined today by David, who's been working on Eco and Encrypt. There's a really cool project that he'll dive into a little bit more. But one thing I did want to mention, they have a sidetrack for Colosseum. So $15,000 up for grabs for people who are being able to build using Eco and Encrypt. And I'm excited, to be able to dive into it all. David, why don't you just give a little bit of introduction about yourself, and then we'll dive into your story, and we'll kind of weave that into what the vision is and how Eco and Encrypt supports the Solana ecosystem.
Sure. First, thank you for having me. So I'm David. I've been an entrepreneur for quite a long time, over 15 years. And mostly my background was cybersecurity, deep tech, worked on a bunch of things, worked on AI stuff before it was cool. And about 4 years ago, myself and two co-founders who also come from cybersecurity and cryptography background decided to start D-Wallet Labs. And the idea was to solve some of the biggest, most difficult problems that required actual deep cryptography research. So problems that, the problems that we identified were around custody and around interoperability, things that until today, I think it's pretty much consensus that there are a lot of issues around that. If we're talking about self-custody, if we're talking about bridges. And then after that, we also added privacy as one of the big problems we wanted to solve. And we did quite a lot of cryptography research, which we're going to talk about soon. But that's kind of the background and how we got to where we are right now.
And one thing I love about what you've been able to build is that it's all from the research side up. So the cryptographic research team is able to make sure that what you're building is at the frontier of the knowledge. Like, how did that lab, how did that team start about, and what was the foundations of that coming together?
Yeah, so when you want to tackle a big problem from like first principles, it's always kind of an unknown journey. You don't really know how it's gonna pan out and what exactly you want to do. So we had this very, very broad idea of this concept that we called a D-Wallet. This is why it's called D-Wallet Labs, which is a decentralized wallet. So one of the problems we identified is you have a lot of decentralized things, decentralized applications that run on the blockchain, but then custody is always off-chain and centralized. So whether it's centralized exchanges or custodians, or even if it's you trying to manage your own custody, it's something that has a lot of issues. And so we wanted to create this new primitive that is a decentralized wallet. And then trying to figure out how exactly to develop the cryptography to enable a decentralized wallet, because the cryptography didn't exist back then, was a lot of back and forth. We had a lot of really smart cryptographers who advised us very, very early on. The ones who were skeptical and were like, oh, you can't solve this problem, maybe find a different problem. So, we didn't continue to work with them, but the ones who, took it as a challenge, eventually some of them became, our cryptographers, our employees. And when we had this kind of initial idea of how we want to solve it, then we needed to research cryptography in order to actually make it happen. So it was a very long process of figuring out, understanding the problem we want to solve, understanding the high level solution, then the design, and then doing the cryptography research to actually solve it. And I think an interesting anecdote is that while, when we started, obviously we didn't know exactly what type of cryptography we'd need to research in order to solve it. And as we moved along, one of the things that we researched in order to solve this problem was something called homomorphic encryption. And then after the fully homomorphic encryption, and we achieved quite a lot of breakthroughs in that field in order to solve a different problem. But a lot of the people who know about homomorphic encryption, fully homomorphic encryption, know that this is something that is very useful for privacy. So we actually achieved quite a few breakthroughs that also can help solve another big problem that we're now solving with Encrypt, that just it just happened because we didn't really know what exactly we are going to research in order to solve the first problem. So this is kind of how it works with when you go from like research and first principles, is you never really know how it will look like. The good thing is we were able to have all these breakthroughs and to solve not only the problem we wanted to solve, but also additional problems. But it just as well could have ended with us not being able to solve it and just, failing, right? So, it is interesting and we're happy with how it turned out. But that's the journey.
Yeah, and it's like an interesting parallel for a startup when they're pivoting and they're trying to figure out what they should do, and they're working with their customer and iterating with them to get to what that product market fit is. It's almost like here you are like on the other side, you were just like really deep in solving the problem, and the product market fit is more about what's the application of that problem. And sometimes as you're describing, the application is different to what your initial hypothesis was for where you were going. And then how does then that blend into then turning that into then a business? From like having an initial problem to then now this is a startup that you're fundraising for and that you're going through that traditional journey. How did you find that transition? Or is it not a transition? Is it just organic in it and it's just about bringing in different team members to fill the gaps, what it looks like?
Yeah, so I think at first, so we're experienced entrepreneurs. So when we first raised money, it was basically investors investing in us, right? So we had this problem that we wanted to solve. We didn't know exactly how we were going to solve it, but that is what we raised money for. But then eventually you can't keep raising money just because you want to solve a problem. So you need to do stuff to create this, at least this appearance of or feeling of progress towards the solution. And so this was part of the early fundraising journey was, we now know how we want to research. We now have this world-renowned researcher on our team. We now achieved this breakthrough, right? And that allowed us to continue to fundraise. At some point, you then, when you're clear about how the solution looks like, you then start to put that into a real business model. And in this case, the business model, both for Ika and Encrypt, is actually a decentralized network. So the network is, you can think about it a bit like Solana. It's a proof of stake network. You use the token in order to stake. You use the token in order to use the tech. So with Ika in order to generate signatures, with Encrypt in order to run computations over encrypted data or decrypt it. So you need to pay with the token, and you need to stake it in order to secure the network, and the operators of the network receive the staking reward. So that's kind of the business model that came out because we were able to. That was the best case scenario. So we had fallback options of if we wouldn't have been able to do the research to make it into an actual decentralized proof of stake network, then we had fallback options. But luckily, we were able to do that research. So that became the business model, and then basically the value accrues to the token. So whether it's investors, whether it's community members, users, builders, everything is pretty clear that where the value accrues.
Yeah, creates that alignment. And let's then just dive into a little bit there. So you talked about like Ika and Encrypt as two networks that you can use. Like, do you want to just dive into each of those, or kind of leave it up to you which one you start with? Because I know it's quite interesting. You've got these like two parallel products, but they kind of work intertangled together with them. So do you just want to dive into the product a little bit?
Yeah, I think the easiest is to start with Ika, which is also chronologically first. It's also live now. Encrypt isn't live yet. So Ika is a threshold signature network. And maybe in order to explain exactly what it is and how it's different from other threshold signature solutions, we can start with the problem that Ika is trying to solve. So the problem is what we call zero trust custody or zero trust interoperability. Today, if we look at how blockchain is built, blockchains have accounts, addresses. These addresses are derived from a public key, which is derived from a private key, and then only the person who possesses the private key can generate a signature. That's kind of the basic way you access a blockchain. Obviously, that created a lot of problems. Anyone who ever touched a blockchain knows that this is one of the biggest friction points of a blockchain, because it creates this very binary and very scary situation where if you have the private key, you have full control, and if you don't, you have zero control. And this is not how we're used to think about systems. We're used to think about systems with access control. So I have permissions, someone can do reset password, you have all these mechanisms that we're used to, and we just don't have them in blockchain. And so this creates a lot of barriers, and the solutions over the years were either trust a third party, right? Like a custodian or a centralized exchange, to completely abstract all that stuff, which, is a solution that works, but it is antithetical to what blockchain is supposed to achieve. Blockchain is supposed to allow us to not trust third parties. And so if our access to blockchain is dependent on third parties, it's kind of a self-defeating loop. So that is one way that users and businesses solved it. The other way, the next way they solved it is with MPC. So if you're familiar, there's the most famous company is called Fireblocks, but there are a lot of different MPC wallets. And what MPC does is it allows you to break up the private key into a few shares. So for example, in the Fireblocks model, you as the user hold a single share, and then Fireblocks hold another share, and together you can generate a signature, and then Fireblocks can enforce access control. So they can be like a dashboard with different users and different permissions and what they can and can't do, and recover password or whatever, right? But you still don't trust Fireblocks completely because they can't generate a signature by themselves. They still need to have you as the user. And that creates a much better user experience, but there are a few issues. One, it is still centralized. So although it's not, you don't have to trust them because they can't steal the assets, you're still trusting them to enforce access control. And then the other is that it's a black box, right? This is something that you can use for whatever Fireblocks allows you to use it. But if you're a developer, you can't use it in your application. You can't just, take Fireblocks and implement it in your Solana program or anything like that. So this is how that will solve. And then you had MPC networks, which basically said, let's take Fireblocks and decentralize it. But by doing it, they remove the user from the process. So you went back to not having control over the process. So no one was able to really solve this, where you can make something decentralized, you can make it a developer primitive, but still the user doesn't have to trust anyone. It's zero trust cryptographically. And so what we created is a new MPC protocol, and it's called 2PC MPC. And essentially, it is a two-party computation. So multi-party computation means there's multiple parties that together can generate a signature in this case. With two-party computations, it's two. And the two parties are the user and the ICA network. And the ICA network is a nested MPC between all the validators of the ICA network. So in order for, and this creates what we call a D-wallet, a decentralized wallet. And the decentralized wallet is something that can generate a signature to any network. It can hold assets on any network, and it's controlled by both a user and a decentralized network together. And that allows you now, as a Solana developer, for example, to write logic that extends beyond Solana. You can now write logic on Solana on whether or not a signature is generated for Bitcoin or for Ethereum or for any other network that existed or will exist in the future. And this is a really powerful tool because you don't have to wrap assets. So we talked about custody, right? So you can build custody logic, but you can also build interoperability logic. So now you don't need to wrap assets from other chains and then create a derivative and create bridge risk and create counterparty risk and trust the third party to hold the underlying assets. You don't need to do any of that. You can just directly, natively control any native asset on any other blockchain from your Solana program. And so that is the initial problem we wanted to solve, and ICA solves that problem. And you can now, we launched ICA a few months ago on Sui, but we're now moving to Solana. And you can already start building your applications on Solana, and soon when ICA is live on Solana, you'll be able to actually control native assets on any chain from Solana. While we were doing that, as I said, we worked on homomorphic encryption. So the way that the nested MPC works within ICA is with homomorphic encryption. This is how no ICA validator has access to the network share, but only homomorphically together they can generate it. And I'll explain what homomorphic encryption is. It is a special type of encryption where you can actually run computations over encrypted data without decrypting it. So This is one of the biggest problems with encryption. Encryption is very powerful and it can keep our data safe, but you can't really do anything with the data. The data has to be static. The moment you want to do something with the data, you need to decrypt it. And then you run into issues of what happens when the data is decrypted. And so homomorphic encryption or fully homomorphic encryption is a very powerful way to encrypt data because you can actually do stuff with the data without decrypting it and you can keep it private. And in the context of blockchain, this is mostly discussed in the context of privacy. You can now have an encrypted program where all the data is encrypted and it still works as expected. It's still decentralized. You still, no one can cheat. So you can have a DEX that is completely encrypted. No one knows what the positions are, and you can still transact and you can get the exact result that you would get from a public DEX. There are a lot of other really cool use cases for FHE on blockchain, which maybe we'll go into soon, but that's the general idea. And we, as part of the research for ICA, we had some pretty significant breakthroughs in fully homomorphic encryption. So we decided to also launch Encrypt, which is a network that takes these breakthroughs and puts it into a decentralized network. And what that allows is for Solana programs to now be encrypted, and they will use the Encrypt network in order to run the computations and in order to, whenever a user, for example, wants to exit, they can decrypt. There's a threshold decryption network as part of Encrypt. So that is what the Solana program will be able to use, but the Solana program itself can be completely encrypted. So now with these two capabilities, and maybe one last thing is Encrypt also uses ICA under the hood in order to coordinate between the different components. So you have the FHE computation and you have the threshold decryption and you have the Solana program, and all of these need to talk to each other, and they use ICA, which is a threshold signature network, in order to talk to each other. So this is the capabilities that are added with ICA and Encrypt. And in a nutshell, any Solana program will now be able to be completely encrypted, completely private. You'll be able to control assets on other chains, and all of that in a very seamless way directly on Solana without having to trust any other third party.
And it's a pretty powerful stack when you're able to kind of like mention it in the final words that you said there, of like you can own it and you can manage any different asset across any different chain with encrypted programs, and being able to connect those dots so any builder can have that freedom to build something which can be privacy first, but also then still be able to access all the different networks around. How do you see then that vision of like the type of products people can be able to build with this new stack that they've got at their tools, in their tool belt to be able to build with?
So I think there are two ways to think about it. One is existing Solana builders, right? Whatever idea you have, you now have two very powerful tools that you can use. One of them is you can expand to any network you want from Solana, right? The other one is you can make anything you want confidential. So those are very two powerful tools on whatever existing Solana project or new Solana project, right? They now have these two very powerful tools. I think another interesting way to think about it is that there are a lot of people who build stuff in crypto today that are not necessarily, a Solana builder, right? I'll give you an example. There's a very, very successful product that a lot of developers use called Privy, right? Privy is embedded wallets. So in order to solve problems for users who you want to onboard the blockchain without all the friction, then you use Privy. The problem with Privy is Privy was just acquired by Stripe, by the way. When you're using Privy, you now have vendor lock-in, and you're now basically renting your users' accounts. Instead of users actually owning their assets and owning their account, you're renting it from Stripe, right? Stripe owns all your users. And this is, by the way, why Stripe bought Privy, right? Because they want to own all the users of Privy. So Privy is not a Solana builder, right? And Privy are solving like a very broad problem for crypto. But now, if you want to build the next generation of Privy, the competitor of Privy, the Privy that will be actually fully decentralized, the Privy that won't require any vendor lock-in and won't require trusting a third party, you can now build that on Solana, right? There's no other place that you can build that, because you can only build that with the 2PC MPC tech that we created for ICA. But you can just create, and there's, by the way, there's already a company that's doing that, but predict that there are going to be more companies that do that. So the company that's doing that is calling it wallet as a protocol instead of wallet as a service, because it's going to be a protocol. And then the users actually own their stuff. It's all on chain. It's all on Solana. It's all managed through Solana. But you don't necessarily need people to know or think that wallet as a protocol is a Solana solution, because it's just a crypto solution. It's built on Solana, but it's built for all of crypto. Another good example is AI agents, right? AI agents need wallets in order to transact, but if you give them a wallet, now they have full power, right? If you want to constrain them, you now need to, again, rely on a third party to enforce some sort of access control. Now you can build that solution for AI agents, any AI agent that can operate across any network with any type of asset, but you will build the guardrails. You will build the access control mechanism on Solana. So you can build an agentic wallet solution on Solana. No one needs to think about it as a Solana application. It is just a crypto application on Solana, right? And now when we're going into confidentiality, right, and things like that, this is one of the biggest barriers for institutions or even just for, normal users to onboard to crypto. Now, confidential crypto programs will be built on Solana with Encrypt, but again, they don't have to be perceived necessarily as a Solana application. So I think the two ways to think about it is Solana applications now have very powerful tools, and then also kind of broad, generic crypto applications will now be built on Solana because of this stack.
And I think that it's pretty cool how you're describing it there, like the opportunity where now you're creating your application with somewhere like a Privy, you're renting it from Stripe essentially to be able to have access to those wallets. But now with Eco and Encrypt, we can be able to have a version where the user is actually being able to still retain their assets, and then you can have levels of access control, which is quite fun to be able to play with as a builder of like what options that you can be able to create for your users, for the customers, either side of that equation. I mean, it's going into a very cool direction. And before we go into a couple questions from any of the audience, where are you starting to see your roadmap? Like you mentioned about how Eco and Encrypt, they're about to be live on Solana. Like, what's your timeline? What are you looking forward to over these next few months? And where you want to start seeing the company and the vision start going in the next few years?
So yeah, we announced a few weeks ago that just the beginning of the month or end of March that we're going to launch both Eco and Encrypt on Solana. Hopefully that will happen maybe early next quarter. That's the goal, for them to be live on mainnet. It's already live on DevNet, so you can already build with both Eco and Encrypt, and you can be ready with your application for when we actually launch on mainnet.
And submit into the Colosseum sidetrack.
Exactly, and the Colosseum sidetrack, which we already have a lot of applicants, which is really cool to see. So that is in terms of getting ready to launch and getting people starting to build stuff with it. In terms of the long-term plan, I think both Eco and Encrypt introduce very novel concepts into crypto. So historically, these things usually take at least a couple of years to mature and to find the breakout applications. I do think that there is a good chance with Solana, because the developer velocity and the user velocity is just tremendous. I think that timeline might shorten, but that's basically kind of the time horizon that we're thinking about these things. Is there's a lot of things that this tech can replace, right? If we're talking about custody solutions, if we're talking about bridges, if we're talking about just like transparent applications and moving them into being more private. So there's a lot of existing things that need to either transition or to be replaced by this new set of applications that usually takes, a couple of years. And then after we figure out what is the what are the main use cases, what are the breakthrough applications that get the most traction, then we can double down. I can, for example, say that with Encrypt, there's a very, very cool concept that we're thinking about introducing. It'll probably be, I don't know, in let's say a year, something like that. But it is a concept around being able to connect Web3 and Web2 And we do that by encrypting TLS communication. So we call it FHE TLS. So TLS is the communication protocol between, whenever you see HTTPS and you see the small green lock, that means you're communicating over the TLS protocol. And what we're thinking is you can encrypt the TLS protocol over FHE, which means the actual encryption of the TLS protocol will be with FHE, with fully homomorphic encryption. And that means that you can have a smart contract or program on Solana that will be able to do verifiable and confidential calls to APIs, but both read calls and also write calls. So you can now rethink, for example, things like oracles. You don't need an oracle because you can get the price API directly into a Solana program. But also you'll be able to control your bank account or your brokerage account. So you'll be able to do all these things in the same manner that you would do things within a blockchain. You now would be able to extend that into Web 2. And I think that's like, for example, a very interesting design space that can be opened with FHE and with Encrypt on Solana. But that's kind of what we're thinking about for the longer time horizon is figuring out what are the really new areas that we can open up, and then starting the design space around that, bringing initial builders, and it's kind of iterative cycles. So we now have this cycle of the initial use cases, and then we'll have like the next one. And in the background, there's always working on more advanced cryptography and continuing to push the state of the art, both in existing, so making FHE better, making FHE faster, making MPC better and faster, but also coming up with things that are currently only theoretical and not practical. There's things like functional encryption, things that most people in crypto aren't talking about because they're not practical yet, but if we can make them practical with more research, then that could really be a game changer for a lot of things. So these are kind of the three levels that we're thinking on.
I love that. And it's all centered around like creating these new tools that builders can be able to use to elevate what they're doing and be at the heart of what the industry was about, this decentralization nature, and making sure that the power is still within the users and we can still do things peer-to-peer.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest things that we're struggling with since the early days, which is there's this really new cool technology that allows for the first time for this self-sovereignty and these things that you can really imagine in the past, but we're always struggling with the user experience that creates, right? So whether it's, at first, what we sacrificed was speed and privacy, right? And obviously user experience, because it was very hard. And then Solana came along and they solved speed, right? Now you don't have to sacrifice speed in order to still have these guarantees. But still you had a very problematic user experience and you still sacrificed privacy, right? And so I think solving all of these problems we're still in the journey of making blockchain or fulfilling the promise that blockchain initially had. And I think, being able to solve these big problems is necessary in order for us to get there. So it's always, the easiest path is always to say, okay, let's just forget about decentralization or forget about self-custody. Or, on the other side, forget about user experience and let's just keep it niche and not get, mass adoption. That's the easy path. The hard path is to be able to fulfill the potential and the promise of blockchain without sacrificing any of the things and without turning it into a niche that can't be really adopted in the real world.
And it's important we do hard things. Awesome. So who wants to ask the first question?
You can go for it. So how is different than Zama?
Sorry?
You want to say it again?
How is your product is different than Zama?
So Zama is working on. So there are a few things, but I think the main three things I would say is the underlying cryptography that Zama is using is based on a protocol called TFHE or FHE over Torus. And they're using a threshold protocol called Noah's Ark. Both of them have very, very significant limitations on performance and on decentralization. Mm-hmm. So, for example, right now, Zama has a 13 13-party committee for threshold, and with a threshold of 1/3. So 5 out of 13 can decrypt everything on Zama. We believe, for example, that's a bit fragile, right? But beyond that, the performance of Zama, because of the underlying cryptography, is very, very, very limited. As an example, when Zama did launch their token, they did an auction, and in order to calculate the clearing price of the auction, they had to run computations for 72 hours, roughly, right? 3 days to find a single value, right, of what is the clearing price. And they did that without any other application competing over these resources, right? So we don't think that, today you can use Zama for maybe very, very, very limited things like transfers, right? But transfers you can already do with ZK. So it's not really interesting to use FHE for transfers. You want to use FHE for DeFi, right? For things that have a shared state. And our FHE is built on our research that dramatically improved the state of the art of FHE. And that is why it is going to be practical for use cases like DeFi, and that's kind of the main thing. I think the other two things is we believe that Zama focused on Ethereum mostly, and we believe that's a mistake, and we're focusing solely on Solana. We're 100% Solana aligned. Everything is built for Solana. It's not going to be available anywhere else other than Solana. And also in terms of the developer experience, we believe that we solved a lot of problems around having a very, very simplified developer experience where you don't have to understand the FHE and the cryptography, and you can just develop like you would develop any other Solana program, and it will basically compile it into an FHE powered Solana program.
Awesome.
Hello there. I want to ask specifically about the interoperability. How is it different from all the other layer zeros? And plus, when you're writing your smart contracts, do you have to write your smart contract for like a Solidity one as well, or how would it work for Bitcoin?
Okay, so it's the same answer actually for both questions. So the main thing that is the difference between, so what you mentioned layer zero, that's like cross-chain messaging, right? What cross-chain messaging does is you have a smart contract on Ethereum, you have a smart contract on Solana. Now you have a committee that attests to what is the state of Ethereum, let's say, and then they take that message, sign it, and put it in the Solana smart contract, and vice versa. You take the message that is signed by the committee, right? In Wormhole, for example, it's guardians. In layer zero, it's DVNs, right? Which got a bit notorious when there were decentralized validator network with one validator. But that's basically the committee that signs the message, and then you get the message in the... So what are the limitations there? The limitation is you have these committees that are signing, you have to trust them, right? So if you're, for example, wrapping your Sol on Solana and then getting the wrapped Sol on ETH, you're trusting the committee, right, to tell you that what is the state here and there. And this has been how bridges have been exploited in the past, right? You found some either logical bug or bug in the smart contract or whatever, and you were able to trick the smart contract or the committee into believing something is true when it wasn't. So that is one thing. And the second problem is that this is limited to smart contract networks, and it's limited in scalability because, as you said, you need to build a smart contract on every single network. With ICA, you completely change the paradigm. So what you do is you don't have a smart contract on Ethereum. You have an account on Ethereum. From the Ethereum perspective, this is like a MetaMask, right? Ethereum doesn't understand, but this account, the signatures can only be generated through the user plus the Solana program. Okay, so then let's say you now control, let's say Bitcoin, right? You control one BTC on Bitcoin, right? You don't, as I said, you also don't need a smart contract because you do it through the account directly. Now, if you want to, let's say, send that one BTC, you would need to have the user cryptographically approve it. Plus, it would need to go through the access control, whatever the access control is set on the Solana program. So let's say this is part of a multi-chain swap protocol, right? Instead of taking one BTC, giving it to the bridge, getting wrapped BTC on Solana, and then doing the swap on Solana, what you would do is you would have the swap protocol on Solana. The swap protocol would say only if the one user approved there, let's say you're swapping 1 BTC for, I don't know, what is it, like 100 Sol, right?
Yeah.
Something like that. No, sorry, it's more than 100 Sol, right?
For the sake
Whatever,
of example.
1,000 Sol. So you take 1 BTC and 1,000 Sol, and so you have two different users. One would say, I am giving 1 BTC, and that BTC lives on Bitcoin, but is controlled by the program on Solana. And then you have 1,000 Sol that's on Solana, it's controlled by the same program. And only when the program sees those two, it does the atomic swap. And so you never have to trust an entity and then wrap it and put it on Solana. You do the transaction on Bitcoin and on Solana, governed by a program on Solana.
Would the user make the program then?
So the program would be a program for, let's say, atomic swaps in this example, right? It could also be lending, right? It could be any type of program. It could be just custody, right? Whatever type of program. And the user would be a user of that program, right?
Okay. Makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, so first question is, how do we find you on X? And secondly, in terms of like what you've got so far, do you have like pre-built components, smart contracts that can be used for stablecoins out of the box instead of us having to develop it?
So two great questions. So the websites are ika.xyz and encrypt.xyz. Ika is IKA. On X, it's as well IKA.dot.xyz. So ika.xyz spelled out, and encrypt is encrypt_xyz. That's the X account. I'm on X, I'm D3H3D_, which is a very weird at, but it is what it is. And in terms of ready-made things, we have in the documentation, so docs.ika.xyz or docs.encrypt.xyz, you can see a bunch of different examples. We also have a few example repos that we have that people are using in order to not start from scratch. In any case, if you are building, reach out to us. We are very responsive. We have a group on a Discord channel for builders, where builders also help each other. So yeah, definitely if you are exploring Ika and Encrypt, reach out. We'll add you to the group, and we're happy to, we're actually updating on X our DevRel updates almost 2-3 times a week about things that we're adding that come from conversations with developers on the things that they need and they want. So definitely reach out and make sure you're connected.
Amazing. Awesome. Were there any final questions? No? Awesome. Well, David, thank you for being able to join us. Thank you everyone for being able to tune in. Remember, they have the sidetrack at Colosseum, $15,000 up for grabs. So make sure you get building for that. And David, thank you for being able to join us.
Thank you for having me. This was great.
Awesome. Big round of applause.